What am I going to do? So let me just give I'm just going to have to give a real brief, hopefully a brief review here, so we can get back to uh, the class, and some people who haven't seen it will see it. So once again, very briefly, we're going to be looking at the Byzantine Empire today. The Byzantine was that eastern part of the Roman Empire that spoke Greek largely and existed for 1,000 years, whose capital is Constantinople. And they were, it was an empire that went on for 1,000 years after Theodosius and the breakup and the fall of the West. East continued for 1,000 years, remained very wealthy. So today we're talking about various factions within the Byzantine Empire, and particularly in Constantinople. And this is a picture you see on the screen of a stadium where some very important events took place. And at the time of Justinian, who was the most significant emperor during Byzantine Empire's history, and presided over a huge expansion over his empire. I was saying that the Byzantines were perennially at war with the Persians on their eastern frontier, constantly at war with them. He had made peace with them. He had started to revise the legal code of the Byzantine Empire, and that caused not only the wars, which caused taxes to be raised, but also his code created huge unrest. And this unrest found its focus in supporters of various chariot racing teams in the stadium who would wear different colors. So there'd be the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites. And these people also were kind of a combination of kind of street gangs and political factions. And they also had theological issues that they sided with, interestingly enough, because theology was still tearing apart some parts of the empire. And the debates about Christ's nature were still very significant in Constantinople. Remember, we talked about Nestorius, who had been a leading archbishop, the Archbishop of Constantinople, and he had a point of view that kind of divided Christ's nature into two, but really didn't give a perfect union. So it was like Christ was two different natures. And instead of the Creed of Chalcedon tells us that those two natures were separate and not commingled, but were still perfectly united in one. It seems a little bit difficult perhaps just to understand that debate, but there were street riots in Constantinople over questions of that kind that partly are due to the finesse of the Greek language. So here there was violence that was in the street. So I'd like to ask you a question. Whoops, keep finding other people who are asking to be admitted. So I'm just going to stop the screen sharing a minute, and I want to ask you a question here, and that is, our faith is really crucial to us. It's important. You expressed that last week, the importance of Christ's nature. It's important for us to think clearly on that subject. So how do we protect ourselves from violence or repression in that area? How do we think through the importance of our faith that keeps us from repressing people who are a different opinion? What's the principle there that would help us understand these things? And I'm open to any ideas who'd like to say something. Hi, Nancy. Sorry, I didn't see your your request to get in right away, but please come join us. And we don't see your screen, so if you raise your hand, we're not going to see. Matt? Or we don't see a face. Yeah, go ahead.
So the main thing is, yes, there will be disagreements, but you need to speak. But the thing that keeps that is love between the members. That's the thing that Christ said would set us apart, is love between the members. So even though we may disagree, we still love each other, and therefore no tensions.
Okay, so I hear that it's important for us, even though we might have different doctrinal ideas, love is still at the heart of the Christian faith. Timothy, you'd raised your hand too. Please unmute him if you would, Liz, and he'll have to come up closer here.
We look at Jesus as our example again, another thing you'll notice is even if he disagreed with the Pharisees, unless they were doing something ridiculous like allowing, money changers in the temple, that's the only time Jesus ever actually repressed anyone in any kind of way. He argued against them all the time, and he'd always be correcting them, but he would never be like, all right, get out of the temple, I'm gonna go kick your butt. Like, it was just talking.
Okay, so he expressed verbally his disapproval, but he didn't use violence against his opponents. And to remind you that he did use a whip at one point. And I realize, I see you shaking your head, yes. It does make things a little bit more puzzling, but I appreciate that. Love, Jesus' own example, are really important. What kind of, and this is a question you're going to be asking all your life. When we have power as Christians, what's the principle that regulates our conduct and toward those who disagree with us? That's a tough question. And it's one, to some extent, we're seeing today. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Did you raise your hand again?
Yeah. I just thought of another one. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
I said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. One of the commandments, not commandment, but rules.
All right, so do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule. Do we really want to integrate that into our Christian lives? Yes, go ahead, Tim.
Another thing, I was thinking about what you said about the whip just now, and I think there is a certain point where you have to defend your values. And defend doesn't necessarily mean use violence, depending on what's going on. But at that point, people are disrespecting God's holy presence, right? And that's why Jesus is like, get out, you're not allowed here. This is not okay. So he brings out the whip. And for us, I'd say something in a modern context that's similar is that something like abortion, where there are children dying, is something that's worth pushing for very hard, even if it means saying like putting a religious principle in the government, even that's what it means.
So we have a right to put a religious principle in the government and create laws related to that. When a holy place is defiled, you're saying, or holy, then that it might be right for us to establish boundaries and say no. Okay. I think those are all important points to think about. These questions can be very complex. But it is appalling that there was violence in the streets over theological issues. Some say that the kind of street riots that went on so weakened Syria and Egypt that it's one of the reasons that Islam, when Islam came in, people were kind of relieved. Where do we draw the line in our own faith? Where do we draw the line? I don't have any real good answers to that, but I think all of us need to think about it. Because our faith is so important to us. We have passionate feelings about them. And are we willing at some time, at times, to be like Christ and allow ourselves to be defeated? Because love is more important. And when do we raise the whip and say no more? Okay, let's keep going. Thank you for your answers. And I realize they're difficult. I don't have great answers for everything, so let's all keep thinking about those. At the time of these events, the blues and the greens often tried to affect the policies of the emperors by shouting political demands during intermission between races in the hippodrome. Imagine the Seahawks stadium suddenly erupting and Trump supporters and Biden supporters suddenly starting to shout their own demands. The imperial forces and guards in the city would not keep order without the cooperation of the circus factions, which were in turn backed by various aristocratic families of the city. And this included some families who believed that they were had a more rightful claim to the throne than Justinian, who came from peasant stock. So in 531, some members of the Blues and Greens were arrested for murder in connection with deaths that occurred during rioting after a recent chariot race. So you can see that these chariot races were not calm events. Fortunately, we don't have that kind of thing going on during our American football games. And some spectators were eager for more personal action than simply watching from the stands. And as it was, the murderers were convicted and sentenced to be hanged, and most of them were. But on 10th of January, 532, two of them, a blue and a green, escaped and took refuge in the sanctuary of a church surrounded by an angry mob. Justinian was nervous. Tensions were high because of taxes and the rewrite of the legal code, and the Persians were looking over the border. So, and this was called the Sasanian Persians, incidentally. Now there's a chariot race. This was Sasanian Persia. It was huge. It was an empire in its own right. And there was a lot, they were looking over the shoulder of the Byzantines. He needed to make sure things were calm. So he decided to relieve tension a bit by announcing a chariot race and commuted the sentences of the two men who were due to be hanged to imprisonment. But that didn't make the Blues and Greens happy. They wanted those two men pardoned entirely. And so, as you can see, popular politics was a very important part of what it meant for an emperor to rule. He had to keep people calm. And
Are you showing a slide or a video?
Sorry, let me.
Are you showing?
Is the screen not showing?
No, it's just you on the screen.
Oh, that must be scary. Let's see. Why is that not showing? There we go. There you go. There's the Sasanian Empire. Thank you for letting me know, Nancy, or whoever that was. There is the Sasanian Empire. It's huge. Huge. So In 532, an angry populace arrived at the Hippodrome for the races, and they started, first they were saying blue and green, and after a while they started all shouting win or conquer, the Nika in Greek, and the crowds began to assault the palace. The palace was affixed to the circus so that the palace, he could look from his palace right into the circus and see what was going on. And thus began 5 days of rioting with the palace under siege. There were fires that were started all over the city, including the city's foremost church, Hagia Sophia, which later Justinian would rebuild. The rioters, oh, here, I told you I'd show you that too. Here's the inside today of Hagia Sophia. And as you can see, it has Arab emblems all over it. That's on Istanbul. They changed it into a museum, but now the head of Turkey is trying to turn it from a museum into a mosque. So this is what it looks like today inside. So at any rate, this church burned down and Justinian later rebuilt it. And they began to control, they had arms and they began to control things and demanded that Justinian resign, and then declared a new emperor, Hypatius, the nephew of the former emperor Anastasius I. And Justinian, in despair, considered fleeing the city. He found there was a secret route that had been opened up for him, but his wife Theodora dissuaded him, saying, "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Never will I see the day when I am not saluted as empress." Moreover, she said she'd stay in the city rather than flee, quoting this ancient proverb, "Purple makes a fine winding sheet." That is, a purple makes a fine shroud. So Justinian stayed. And now you should ask another question of yourself. And I don't know if we want to open this up for questions. Yeah, why don't we? I just want to try to make sure I see you all. But what do you think? Are heavy taxes and what you consider an unjust law code, an unjust oppression of one's political allies, sufficient cause for a revolt in a Christian empire? What do you think? I'm going to try to open this up so I see it all again. Do you think revolt is justified in a Christian empire when there are heavy taxes? What do you consider to be unjust laws, new laws, whatever, and oppression of your political allies? What do you think? That's a tough one, and I can understand your perplexity. Yeah, Tim, come on up.
So I don't really think it necessarily is, because if you look at, even the early church we were talking about before, they were oppressed. They had people, murdering them, torturing them, and while they refused to recant, which is where I say the line of like, I'm not going to do this, is they refused to do things like burn incense to the emperor. They still went along with the government. They didn't raise arms and try to fight the emperor because he was oppressing Christians. And I'd say, is that affecting your life with Christ? Is that stopping you from, going on to eternal life? It's not. You mean you can live under high taxes, you can live in a pretty poor environment and still be, good in your life with Christ.
I like that response, Tim. Thank you. Yeah, Grace. Liz, rather.
Yeah, I believe that it depends on how how we go about with raising our concerns. Because one thing is to, request changes, to maybe protest, but we have to do it from a Christian standpoint. Obviously, these people felt like they were being oppressed, like they were being taken advantage of. As Christians, I believe that they are in their right to seek justice in their living situations, and they have the right to do it, just not in a violent way, because then they would be like, well, aren't you supposed to be a Christian? You're over here trying to force things instead of trying to do it peacefully. And I kind of, while you were asking the first question as well, what came to my mind is what is actually happening in places like California right now. We try to look at the Bible and say, well, the Bible says that we must submit to our authorities, but the Constitution says we have a right to gather and worship. And so a lot of pastors see themselves kind of like asking themselves that question. As Christians, we should obey our government, but as Christians, we also need to care for the spiritual well-being of our flock. There's churches that are being sued right now in California because they've decided to go ahead and have church gatherings, and then there's churches that are simply just obeying the law, staying home, but they feel like they shouldn't. So I think that the question of where do we draw limits in our faith are not just from the past, but they're pretty relevant at this moment as well.
Absolutely relevant. Absolutely. Thank you, Liz. Yes, Tim. Come back up again, Timothy. Yeah.
So I completely agree with Liz, and I just wanted to make one small comment on that. That's that you can actually consider, because people are debating whether, we should follow what the government is telling us to do, or we should, be fighting for rights and all that. You can consider that the authority that the government has is invested by the Constitution. The Constitution is supposed to be the authority. So just the thought there that we are following the authority.
Yeah. Okay. And the other question that we need to ask is, what is love? All the time. How do we best love? So, as you can see, these are relevant questions. How do I, as a Christian, on the one hand, with my constitutional rights, respond when we think something is unjust?
Mr. Copper.
Do we submit in love? Or do we somehow resist? What is the most important thing? What is most important? And I hear a voice, but I don't see who is talking because I can't see everybody, and I notably can't see Nancy.
Yeah, I was gonna say Nancy's raising her hand.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna answer the last one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it kind of ties into the second question too, I guess. Well, we don't have to put up with the laws that are made if people in the church would rise up and go into politics and get involved into authority and take those positions to be able to speak on our behalf and have others, follow that and actually, move in the same direction and be in unity. And if there was an opening, there's not a lot of people voting, there's not a lot of people doing their part. And if we have people in the secular world who are voting more than the people in the church, it's going to go in that direction instead of the direction which we would want. We could love others. Of course, love is the greatest commandment, and that's fulfillment of the law. And it should be a part of our laws here, you know, to help each other, to always seek somebody else's good and all that. But it needs to be imposed on with the authority at the same level as the secular people, so that they, I guess, they can understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Nancy. All these show that these questions aren't simple. You know, one of the reasons I asked this question, is it okay if there are heavy taxes, unjust laws, and a Christian empire and so forth and what you think is repression of one's political ambition? You know, this was a question that Christians asked during our American Revolution. Is it right to rise up violently? And there were a lot of Christians who said no. And they end up moving to Canada, and there was terrible violence between those two factions. One saying, no, we submit. Another one says, no, we rise up. We're proud of our American heritage and what we have in democracy and all that God has done in this land. But if you were a Christian at the time, you might not have found the issue very easy. And I think there were deeply committed Christians on both sides. Be willing to admit that today too. That there are people on both sides of the issues surrounding some of those we've raised today. And God loves them both, and they're both acting according to their consciences. Just find in your own heart what you think is the animating principle that will help you proceed with integrity and without regret. Okay, let's keep going here. Thank you for your comments. I'm going to, I have to move on here, I think. Anyway, Justinian rallied. He sent in a popular eunuch, a government official, into the hippodrome alone, carrying a bag of gold. The man's courage was legendary. He faced unarmed a murderous mob that had already killed hundreds. He went directly to the blues section, where he approached the important blues and reminded them that Emperor Justinian was a blue. He also reminded them that the man they were crowning, Hypatius, was a green. Then he distributed the gold. The blue leaders spoke quietly with each other, and then they spoke to their followers. And then in the middle of Hypatius' coronation, the blues left the hippodrome. The greens were absolutely stunned. They didn't know what was going on. Then imperial troops, led by two of Justinian's best generals, Belisarius and Mundus, stormed into the hippodrome, killing the remaining rebels. About 30,000 rioters died. Justinian also had Hypatius executed, and he exiled the senators who had supported the riot. And then he rebuilt Constantinople and Hagia Sophia, and went on to huge success. He and his wife differed on theological issues. One was a monophysite, and the other, that is a one nature. There's only one nature. And the other was Chalcedonian, but they got along. And the year after the riots, in the year 533, Justinian sent his general Belisarius to reclaim the former provinces of Africa that had been overrun by Vandals. that Germanic tribe, the Vandals, and who had been in control since 429. So this is over 100 years later, 104 years later, and he took the capital of Carthage and easily overran the Vandals, and then 19 years later had subdued the Berber tribes. In 535, a small Byzantine expedition went to Sicily and also met with success. You know that Sicily's that big island at the boot of Italy. And 5 years later, 540, Belisarius captured Naples, Rome, Ravenna, the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom. Remember, the Ostrogoths had become the Germanic tribe ruling over Italy. And so he took back the whole of the Italian peninsula with the aid of an army of Armenians who arrived to help him. And he also took off a small slice of the Spanish peninsula from the Visigoths. So here's a slide of what you see. The empire was under the time of Justinian. I mean, he was getting back, not including Spain and Gaul, of course, or Britain, but to where the empire had been in the time of the Roman the Roman Empire had peaked. So apart from, as I say, Gaul and Spain and Britain. So he is really doing well here. Ravenna became the capital of the Byzantine Italy from 540 to 751. Here's where Ravenna is. Still exists today with some beautiful ruins. That had been the capital briefly of the last Roman emperor, and then had been the capital of the Ostrogoths, and now it became the capital of Byzantine Italy. Here's a picture of a church that was built in the 6th century, the Basilica of San Vitale, and as you can see, it still stands. All right. So, and here is inside the church. These are extraordinary structures. Extraordinary. We think we are so good with our architecture and stuff. The arts back in those days were extraordinary, and architecture. Nowhere in the world was anything like it. So he also, Belisarius, pushed Slavs and Bulgars back across the Danube. These tribes were also invading from Central Asia, and he pushed them back across the Danube. He revised something called the Code of Justinian. It took him about 5 years to do, from 529 to 534. And there's a copy of that Code of Justinianus. And that reorganized the whole system of law for the whole rest of the Byzantine era. As a matter of fact, that code lasted for 940 years. And if you think about this for a little while, you'll understand something of the nature of Byzantine Christianity. Same code, 1,000 years. And that is that this was a profoundly conservative establishment with an inalterable law code, and in ecclesiastical circles, an unchanging liturgy. So some things remain static for over 900 years. Liturgy remained the same. Law code remained the same. But they had constant theological bickering over what we would think of as unimportant details. This was also the golden age of hymn writing in the Greek church, with 3 hymn writers in particular giving a rich heritage to the Byzantine church. Even Emperor Justinian wrote hymns. So it was a period marked by the development of what the Greek church calls the divine liturgy. That just remained unchanged. Nevertheless, those are the problems that were going on at this time. Epidemics began to occur. The empire was weakened nonetheless. Why? Because of epidemics sweeping the empire. We have our pandemic today. It was nothing like these epidemics back in those days. They didn't have the medicine we do. Lombards were invading into northern Italy. Remember, we call that Lombardy today, northern Italy. These are Lombard Germanic tribes. Avars and Slavs again began crossing the Danube. And war started up again with the Persian, ending with a Persian defeat after a huge war in 627. So Justinian died in 565, and all these problems broke loose. The main army was finally defeated of the Persians, as I say. But in 634, the worst nightmare of the Byzantines came to pass. Another force arose. This was Islam. And in 634, this city called Ctesiphon fell to Islamic forces in 634. Ctesiphon was one of the capitals of Persia and a great center of Nestorian Christianity. They sent out missionaries all over the world and still did so for hundreds of years after this. But this capital fell. And only 7 years later, after the Persians were defeated by the Arabs, no, this was only 7 years after the defeat of the Persian armies by the Byzantines. And 2 years after the fall of Ctesiphon, the 5-day battle of Yarmouk in 636, in what is now southern Syria near the borders of Jordan and Israel, the Arabs destroyed a Byzantine army, which was actually numerically superior. The Byzantines were superior, but they had not coordinated their defense among its generals, and the Arabs defeated them. And so the Arabs took over possession of Syria and Palestine and Egypt, and the world was changed forever. This was not the end of the Byzantine Empire, however, which resisted for another 800 years until it fell in 1453. But it was the end of the rule by Christian monarchs in the Middle East, and shortly thereafter of Egypt and North Africa. So what can we say about the Byzantine Church? What we call the East Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Church today. What do we know? We know that the emperor took an active role in the affairs of the church, but left much to the direction of the patriarch, as the leader of the church was called. Byzantines viewed the emperor as a messenger of Christ, responsible for the propagation of Christianity among pagans and for the administration and finances of the church. That's really important. When an emperor is going to administer the finances of the church and also administer a lot about who is chosen in various bishoprics, he was an important man. But in time, that emperor lost more and more power, in particular as Russia became into the fold and became Orthodox. We have a situation today in which there are various patriarchs around the East Orthodox Church, and the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Christian Eastern Orthodox Church in Istanbul today is tiny because of so many years of persecution, but nevertheless, he's considered to be the first among equals. Eastern Orthodoxy is Chalcedonian. They subscribe to the Chalcedonian Creed that we looked at last Tuesday in 451. They subscribed to that. Eventually, that became its principal creed. And so they share that with the West. Right. So here is what's really important. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about this. The most important controversy that came over the church during this Byzantine time, or was actually was the Iconoclast controversy. And there you find a man with a pole, and he is smashing a mosaic image of Christ or the apostles or somebody else. Just a little history. In the early church, there didn't seem to be much objection to Christians painting images of Jesus, of Christ or the apostles, as we find them on tombs and in ancient Christian places of worship. However, when Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, many bishops began to fear that the masses flocking into the churches would begin to worship images or icons of Christ rather than worshiping Christ in spirit and in truth. So they began to preach against the use of icons as objects of worship. The controversy continued for several hundred years, until finally, in the 8th century, several of the Byzantine emperors became convinced that the use of these images was actually distorting the faith of Christians and serving as objects of worship. So they took steps to outlaw this practice and the use of icons. And so we come to the year 754, when Emperor Constantine V called a council that forbade their use altogether. Constantine V wished to draw Christians tempted by the conversion of Islam back into the fold. You know that Islam forbids the reproduction of any kind of images of saints or of Muhammad or of people. And so Constantine forbade that, and so that he could draw some of these people who are being tempted to convert to Islam back into the fold. And there was a lot of Christians, huge numbers of Christians, living in Islamic lands at this time. At the beginning, Islam was no more than a mist over a sea of Christians. And some of them were tempted by Islam. Remember that in Exodus, the 2nd commandment forbids the creation of any image representing God. And Muslims reaffirm this. And we do know that in general, somewhat counterintuitively, it was the poor, many of whom lived on the edges of the Byzantine Empire and were subject to constant Islamic raids, who were opposed to the use of images. The poor were. Whereas the rich, the monks, and the urbanites generally supported the use of images. So here we go. Another question for you. What do you think? Are the use of images in worship a bad thing? Why outlaw the use of images in worship? Is that a sin? What do you think? Yeah, Matthew.
Not necessarily, but I can understand the concern. There is a possibility of it, but there's a possibility that you can just use it to remember Christ. Like, yeah, this is the specific person to whom I worship. Instead of for some people, what I'm trying to say is for some people, having an image in front of them focuses their mind instead of wandering.
Okay. So it's a help for some people. It focuses their mind, reminds them of Jesus. Okay. Any other comments? What do you think? Is this wrong? Yeah, Nancy. Go ahead.
So isn't this going on kind of right now? Because I know BLM is trying to cause for the church to tear down images of Christ, saying that it's hate, or that we stand for hate instead of love. And I think like a lot of people were really saddened by it. that somebody actually wants to do that. But at the same time, there are people in the church who are like, we don't worship images anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And there's lots of monuments and everything that represent stuff to remind people of history. So I see Matthew's point of view of it, because it is like, if you don't see it, you forget it. And there's people who just go to church and then they forget what they heard all week, and then they have to go back and hear it again and be constantly reminded and have it right in front of them.
Thank you. Good. Yeah. Liz.
Yeah, so I can see where Matt is coming from, and with people that I've spoken to about images that they have and why they like to have images of like Jesus or any other entity that they believe they should have, is their argument is, well, you know, as Matthew said, it serves as a reminder of who he is, of the sacrifice that he did. But I have also spoken to people who are against images of any kind, and I don't know if this is correct, but they use Exodus 24 as the basis on why there shouldn't be images. And what Exodus 24 says is, hold on, I have it in Spanish. It says, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above. And so their explanation when they use this is, we don't know what Jesus actually looked like. And so if the Bible says we shouldn't make an image of anything in heaven, then that should fall under it, because we don't know what he looks like now either. And I can also see Nancy's argument, because what I have seen currently is that the argument that people have against images of Jesus is that they say, well, every image of Jesus that we see is white, and he was not white, he was Middle Eastern. Therefore, people shouldn't even be making images of a Jesus that is not accurate.
Very interesting points. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. So let's not represent Christ inaccurately. You might give misconceptions. And a reference to Exodus 20 and the second commandment. Yeah, these are really good points. Any other thoughts? Let's keep going then. And let me just, I'm keeping my eye on the clock here. Anyway, this is what they said in 754, supported by the Holy Scriptures and the Fathers, we declare unanimously, in the name of the Holy Trinity, that there shall be rejected, removed, and cursed out of the Christian church every likeness which is made out of any material and color, whatever, by the evil art of painters. Get that, the evil art of painters. If anyone ventures to represent the divine image of the Word after the incarnation with material colors, let him be anathema. If anyone shall endeavor to present the forms of the saints in lifeless pictures with material colors which are of no value, and does not rather represent their virtues as living images in himself, let him be anathema. So this was the emperor that helped enact that. And they felt that the only real religious image must be an exact image. I think someone said that, maybe Nancy did. It must be an exact likeness of the original. That was, if you're telling somebody that Jesus is white and he's not, and you don't really know what Jesus looked like, but you know he's Middle Eastern, or was that Liz? I can't remember. Then you shouldn't be representing him. And for them, the only exact substance that you can represent is the Eucharist, that is the body and blood of Christ, because they believed it to be the same substance. So any true image of Jesus must be able to express both his divine nature, which can't be reproduced, and his human nature. You got to reproduce them both, because he's both human and divine. by making an icon of Jesus, one is separating his human and divine nature, since only one nature can be depicted. Okay, so there are more to go on that, but let me just continue here. This conflict did not stop. There is something called the iconodules, meaning image worshippers, that fought on. And the chief theological opponent of iconoclasm were the monks Mansur, who was also called John of Damascus, and I don't have the other one. Yeah, Theodore the Studite. And John of Mansur lived in Damascus, so he was under the protection of the Muslims and did not fear the emperor, but Theodore the Studite actually had a monastery in Constantinople. And they argued for the reproduction and of images. And this is what he said. I also venerate, John declared that he did not venerate matter, but rather the creator of matter. However, I also venerate the matter through which salvation came to me, as if filled with divine energy and grace. And he included in this latter category the ink in which the Gospels are written, as well as the paint of images, the wood of the cross, and the body of the blood of Christ. So what they said to the iconoclasts was this: that the biblical commandment forbidding images of God had been superseded by the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus, God became a man in our world. And because he's become a human being, a man, and became incarnate in visible matter, therefore, they weren't depicting the invisible God, but God as he appeared in the flesh. They're not trying to depict God, the invisible or divine part of God, just that which divine appeared in the flesh, and that fleshly or material image becomes a window, as it were, into the divine. And they also pointed to other Old Testament passages. God instructed Moses to make 2 golden statues of cherubim on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. So why can't we create images of holiness since the incarnation? God also told Moses to embroider the curtain which separated the Holy of Holies into the tabernacle with cherubim. Further, in their view, idols depicted persons without substance or reality, while icons, in other words, pagan idols, they were depicting unreal demons and gods. But icons depicted real people. So all religious images that were not of our faith, Christian faith, they considered idols. All images of our faith, of Christian faith, our icons are to be honored or venerated, honored. And they consider this comparable to the Old Testament practice of only offering burnt sacrifices to God and not to other gods, okay? They also talked about what they believed at the time to have been magical kind of creations of icons that weren't human-made. And one of these that they might refer to was the Shroud of Turin, which some of you may have heard of, in which Jesus' face seems to be imprinted on a shroud that surrounded him at the time of the resurrection. We still have that today in Rome. It came from Constantinople. At least that was where it was for many, many years. So there are their arguments. Interesting. We don't have time really to think about that right now. I think we've already heard you a little bit. Now I got to move on, so I'll let you think about that too. So you can see that in all of these discussions, there are points to be considered on both sides. Always be humble and listen Listen to what the other side has to say. There were those arguments. Right. So what can we say about Orthodox worship today? In 842, images were definitely restored, definitively restored in 842. So now they are a very big part of worship in Orthodox Church. If you go into Orthodox Church, you'll see some stuff like this. Those are icons. They are not statues. They are two-dimensional. And icons are heavily at work in Eastern Orthodox worship. Find an Orthodox church today in America, and you will find stuff like this. That's very characteristic. Wanted to say another thing about Eastern art, because Byzantine art is something that you will recognize. This is something called Pantocrator, Christ, ruler of the universe. This I've seen in churches in Sicily with Byzantine influence. They oftentimes will find them in domes of their churches. These paintings, sometimes mosaics of Christ Pantocrator, ruler of the universe. Very characteristic. And mosaics. You look online under mosaics and you'll find a ton of Orthodox mosaics. They use these tiny little tiles to create mosaics in their churches. So here is our embedded question. Let me just say one last thing. There are some, Wikipedia says there's some 220 million members of the Eastern Orthodox Church worldwide. But as it says, half of these are in Russia. It sounds like they're just saying that anybody who's Russian is Eastern Orthodox. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. There are East Orthodox Christians, of course, in America and in South America, and particularly in Eastern Europe. A lot of East Orthodox Christians. Their worship services can go on for hours, and people in Russia in particular, you can go into the worship service and a lot of the liturgy is sung. The Gospels are sung rather than read, and people will be talking in the back. They will kind of listen. They'll stay for a while and then kind of leave, and the service keeps on going on. Very different than ours. So here's our question, our embedded question. I'd like to spend a few minutes and talk about that right now. And that is, what place do you think art should or can play in the Christian faith? Can art be, and or should it be, an important tool in worship? Can art lead people to faith? Now, we're talking about art here. We're talking about questions that sometimes trouble those with a gift of art who are Christians. The difference between the Word of God and art. So I'd like your opinion on that. Tell me what you think, Nancy.
Well, I believe the word says that we should use our talent and not forsake them, and that if that talent is art, that it should be implemented into the kingdom of God and used for His glory. So if that's displaying some kind of picture for somebody to have visually to understand something, I think that it's acceptable and that God wouldn't frown upon it. And I think if the intentions and motives behind it are to advance His kingdom, that there wouldn't be an argument, I guess, about it.
Thank you, Nancy. I see Tim's hand back there first, I think. Thank you.
think it should be allowed because as someone who does a lot of writing, when you look at it, writing, music, painting, all of it, it's the same sort of thing. Even movies and stuff like that, it's all the same thing. It's all art in its own way. I know that sounds really like a hippie kind of thing to say, but
I see
it's
you're
all,
wearing a mask there, so
yeah,
kind of hip.
it's all creativity and expression of what you find beautiful. Like I like to write, and I write about. I mean, sometimes it's depressing stuff, but I write about the things that I find beautiful, and I love reading things that involve themes of self-sacrifice, especially because that's exactly what Jesus is like to me, and I find that to be one of the most beautiful things ever. And while I'm not as much of a fan of painting, I know that that is a way you can worship God because you can worship Him in all art, especially with your writing and your speaking too. Pastors, in a way, are using their own art to honor Christ.
So it's all right to work hard at a message as a minister and make it artistic. Yeah, go ahead. And all the rest of what you're saying too, I affirm is good. Yeah, Matt.
So one reason we can use art is art can be a very good outreach to the culture. It's one way we can get our message out, as he was talking about with movies, also with music and such. There is a very good place for Christian culture, which is often expressed in different forms of art, to be outreach. Like you see those tracts all the time, and in different styles, and those are literally forms of art.
Thank you, Matt. And we just have time for Liz. Go ahead.
Yeah, so art is an expression, is a form of expression, and I agree with those who say that it can be used as a way to reach out to other people, to connect with other people, to expose the gospel and explain the gospel. But I also agree with, I forgot the name of the person who said it, but he said that if we were to use art to create images, it could potentially get to the point where the images become the object of worship instead of being God Himself. So that's where I stand. I agree with the person who said that, but I also believe that God gives us talents for us to glorify Him and to be able to reach out for other people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. You guys have been a great class. Thank you for coming today. It's so much nicer when there are many of you here live. And bless you, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.